The night the Duke of Ashford told Clara Vane she did not look fit to dance with him, every person in that ballroom heard him. The music did not stop. The chandeliers did not dim. The world simply continued turning, the way it always does when it breaks someone quietly. Her father laughed the loudest. What no one in that room could have known, not the ladies behind their fans, not the gentlemen pretending they hadn't heard, not even Clara herself, was that the Duke of Ashford would spend the next 3 years trying to undo those 7 words, and that by the time he understood what he had thrown away in that single careless moment, Clara Vane would no longer be waiting for him to figure it out. This is not a story about a cruel man who became kind. It is a story about a woman who survived him anyway. London, April 1843. The Harcastle Ball was the first great event of the season, and every family with a daughter of marriageable age had spent the better part of 3 weeks preparing for it. Gowns had been altered. Hair had been practiced. Mothers had rehearsed quiet instructions over breakfast tables across the city. Stand straight, speak little, smile often, and do not, under any circumstances, appear too eager. Clara Vane had received no such instructions. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. Her father, Baron Vane, had spent those 11 years working his way steadily through his late wife's money, his own modest inheritance, and the patience of every creditor in London. He was not a cruel man by nature. He was something almost worse, a weak one. He laughed too easily at other people's jokes. He agreed too quickly with whoever was speaking. He had a gift for making powerful men feel comfortable, and he had built his entire social existence on that single talent. Clara had built nothing. She had simply survived. She was 22 years old, and she knew exactly what she was in the eyes of London society. Not poor enough to be pitied, not rich enough to be pursued, not beautiful enough, by the season's very particular standards, to be forgiven for either. She had dark eyes that saw too much and a mouth that said too little, and she moved through ballrooms the way a person moves through a room they know they are not quite welcome in, carefully, quietly, without taking up more space than necessary. She had not wanted to come tonight. Her father had insisted. There will be introductions, he said. Opportunities. He had used that word the way he used most words, loosely, without much thought for what it actually meant. The Harcastle Ballroom was everything these rooms always were. Too hot, too bright, too loud, and full of people performing versions of themselves they hoped others would believe. The chandeliers threw gold light across silk and jewels. The orchestra played at one end of the room. Along the walls, older women sat in careful rows, watching the floor with the focused attention of people who understood that what happened here tonight would be discussed for weeks. Clara stood near the far end of the room with a glass of lemonade. She wasn't drinking, watching the dancers and thinking about the book she had left open on her bed at home. She did not see the Duke of Ashford until he was almost directly in front of her. He was hard to miss, once you noticed him. James Caldwell, the 5th Duke of Ashford, was exactly what the daughters of England had been trained from birth to find impressive. Tall, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy confidence that came not from effort but from never having been told no. He was 30 years old and had been one of the most sought-after men in London for the better part of a decade. He wore it the way certain men wear expensive coats, as though he had simply always had it and saw no particular reason to be grateful. He was moving through the crowd with 2 friends, laughing at something one of them had said, when Clara stepped sideways to avoid a passing footman and moved directly into his path. It was a small collision, barely anything. Clara's lemonade tilted but did not spill. She caught herself immediately and stepped back. "I beg your pardon," she said. James Caldwell looked at her. It was the kind of look that takes a person in from head to toe and finds the sum of them in less than 3 seconds. Clara watched him do it. She had seen that look before on other faces. She knew what came after it. One of his friends, a fair-haired man with a bored expression, leaned slightly toward him and murmured something. A suggestion, perhaps. A jest. The kind of thing men say to each other in ballrooms when they think no one else can hear. James glanced at his friend, then back at Clara. Then he smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "I'm afraid not," he said, loud enough for the small cluster of people nearby to hear clearly. "I don't dance with plain women. It ruins the evening." His friend laughed. Two ladies nearby turned quickly away, fans rising. A gentleman pretended to study the ceiling. And Baron Vane, standing 6 feet to Clara's left with a glass of brandy, and a desperate need to remain in the good graces of the most powerful duke in the room, let out a short, sharp laugh. "Ha, quite right, your grace, quite right." He didn't look at his daughter when he said it. Clara did not move. She stood very still for the length of 3 full breaths. She counted them, without knowing why, and she looked at the Duke of Ashford with her two dark, two-seeing eyes, and she said absolutely nothing. Not because she had nothing to say. She had a great deal to say. She could feel it pressing at the back of her throat, not tears. She would not give him tears, but words, sharp and exact, the kind that leave marks. She knew exactly what she could have said. She thought of at least 4 things in the space of those 3 breaths, each one more precise than the last. She said none of them. Because she understood, in some cold and quiet part of herself, that anything she said right now would only amuse him, would only give him more. Men like James Caldwell fed on reaction, on the proof that they had landed where they aimed. The greatest possible insult she could offer him was the one thing he would not know how to absorb: indifference. She inclined her head exactly the way one inclines one's head to a stranger in a doorway, polite, impersonal, unbothered. Then she turned and walked away, not quickly, not slowly. She walked away at exactly the pace of a woman who had somewhere better to be. She made it to the edge of the ballroom before her hands started shaking. She set the lemonade down on a small side table and pressed both palms flat against the fabric of her skirt and breathed. The music was still playing. The room was still brilliant and bright and entirely indifferent to her. Somewhere behind her, she could hear the low murmur of conversation resuming, the world closing over the moment like water over a stone. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry in the Harcastle ballroom, while her father laughed at her in front of the Duke of Ashford. "You are fine," she told herself. "You are perfectly fine. You have survived worse than a stupid man with a stupid mouth, and you will survive this too." She was still telling herself this when a hand settled lightly on her arm. Clara turned. The woman beside her was old, truly old, the kind of old that has stopped apologizing for itself. She was small and straight-backed, dressed in deep gray silk, with white hair pinned severely at her neck and eyes that were sharp and dark and missed absolutely nothing. Clara did not recognize her. She did not think they had ever been introduced. The woman looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not pity. Clara would have pulled away from pity, but something more like recognition. "I saw what happened," the old woman said. Her voice was quiet, dry, precise. "It was nothing," Clara said. It was not nothing. The woman's grip on her arm was light but did not release. "And you know it wasn't, but you held yourself very well, better than most would have." Clara looked at her. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "No," the woman agreed. "We haven't." She paused, and something moved behind those sharp eyes, something that might have been amusement or calculation or both. "But I have been watching you for some time, Miss Vane, longer than tonight." Clara went still. "Don't waste those eyes on him," the old woman said softly. "Not yet." Then she released Clara's arm, turned, and walked back into the crowd with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never in her life been lost in a room. Clara stood alone at the edge of the ballroom, her hands no longer shaking, staring after a woman whose name she did not know. The orchestra played on. Her father did not come to find her for the rest of the evening. She went home alone in the carriage, in the dark, with the old woman's words sitting in the center of her chest like a coal that had not yet decided whether to burn or go cold. Not yet. As though there would be a later, as though whatever had just happened was not an ending but a beginning. Clara pressed her face briefly to the cold window glass and watched London slide past in the dark. She did not know, could not have known, that the old woman in gray silk was Margaret Caldwell, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, the Duke's grandmother, and that she had just decided something. 6 months is a long time to carry something you are not supposed to put down. Clara had become quite good at it. She had returned from the Harcastle ball that April night, unpinned her hair, sat on the edge of her bed and made herself a quiet and private promise. She would not think about it. Not about the Duke's voice, loud and careless and entirely certain of itself. Not about the laughter that had followed. Not about her father's laugh, that particular laugh, the one he reserved for men he needed something from, high and a little too eager. She kept the promise mostly. There were mornings she managed it perfectly. There were evenings it was harder. London in the summer thinned out, as it always did. The families who could afford to retreated to their country estates. The ones who couldn't afford to pretended they had chosen to stay. The Vanes fell somewhere in the unhappy middle. Baron Vane made noises about the countryside, about fresh air, about the importance of rest, while quietly hoping some financial arrangement would resolve itself before anyone looked too closely at his accounts. Nothing resolved itself. By September, Clara understood the shape of the problem even if her father refused to speak it plainly. The townhouse cost money they did not have. The creditors had been patient, but patience of that particular kind always came with a price attached. There were letters her father read standing up, quickly, then folded and put in his coat pocket without comment. She was not supposed to know about the letters. She knew about the letters. So when her father came to her one morning in October with an expression she recognized, that specific combination of shame and forced cheerfulness he wore when he needed her to agree to something, she was already braced. "There is an opportunity," he said. Clara set down her book. "What kind of opportunity?" "A house. In Wiltshire. Very reasonable terms, very reasonable, Ellie. I've looked at the figures, and the countryside would do you good. The air alone." "Whose house?" she said. Her father cleared his throat. "The Ashford estate manages several properties in the county. Tenant arrangements, very standard, nothing unusual about it." "We would be tenants," Clara said, "on Ashford land." "On Ashford estate land, which is entirely different. There's no reason for anyone to." "Father," he stopped. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He had the grace, at least, to look away first. She thought about refusing. She built the refusal in her mind, assembled it word by word, the way she sometimes composed things she never said aloud. She could tell him no. She could tell him why. She could explain, clearly and without drama, that she would rather live in 2 rooms above a shop in the unfashionable part of the city than spend a single day as a tenant on the Duke of Ashford's land. She thought about all of this. Then she thought about the alternative, about what happened to women in her position when the money ran out entirely, about the aunts in distant counties who might take her in, and the particular quality of life that came with being taken in by relatives who had never especially wanted you. "How long?" she said. Her father's expression collapsed with relief. "A year, perhaps 2, just until things are." "A year," Clara said, "and then we find something else." He nodded quickly, too quickly. She picked up her book again. "Write and confirm the arrangement." The house was called Wren Cottage, which was a generous name for something that was more accurately a modest stone farmhouse at the edge of a village called Thornfield in the quieter part of Wiltshire. It had 4 bedrooms, a small kitchen garden, a parlor with windows that looked out over a sloping field, and a fireplace in every room that Clara immediately understood would be the most important feature come winter. She did not hate it. This surprised her. She had expected to arrive and feel the humiliation of the thing pressing down on everything, the knowledge of whose land this was, whose charity in some indirect and deniable way was keeping a roof over their heads. She had expected to feel watched, diminished. Instead, she felt, on that first morning, something so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it. Quiet. Not the silence of a room where nothing is being said that needs saying. Real quiet. The kind that had texture, birdsong, and wind in the fields, and the distant sound of the village going about its mourning, and nothing demanding anything from her at all. She stood in the kitchen garden with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea and looked at the state of the beds, overgrown, neglected, full of the ghosts of plants that had once been tended, and something loosened in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. She would fix the garden. She didn't examine the decision. She simply went inside, changed into older clothes, and started. The village of Thornfield turned out to be the kind of place that made its mind up about people quickly and didn't easily change it, which meant Clara had approximately 2 weeks to establish herself before the assessment became permanent. She spent those 2 weeks being exactly herself, which was, she had always found, both the easiest and the riskiest strategy available. She helped Mrs. Hatch at the bakery carry flour when the delivery boy didn't come. She sat with old Mr. Fenwick's wife on the afternoons when Mr. Fenwick was too unwell to leave the house and his wife needed someone to talk at. She did not pretend to be more than she was, and she did not apologize for being as much as she was. And by the end of the second week, the village had decided she was all right, which in Thornfield was apparently high praise. Her father, for his part, discovered a gentleman farmer 3 miles away who shared his enthusiasm for cards and long afternoons, and Clara saw him at dinner most evenings and otherwise largely had the days to herself. It was the most peaceful autumn she could remember. She was in the kitchen garden on a Tuesday morning in late October, her hands dirty and her hair coming loose from its pins, when she heard the carriage on the lane. She didn't look up immediately. Carriages came through the village often enough. She was in the middle of untangling a particularly stubborn section of overgrown climbing rose from the stone wall, and it required her full attention, and whoever was arriving had nothing to do with her. Then she heard the housekeeper. The Ashford estate sent a woman called Mrs. Peel twice a week to manage the cottage, come out of the back door and say, in a voice that had gone very straight, "Your Grace." Clara's hands went still in the rose canes. She turned around slowly. He was standing at the edge of the garden path, still in his riding coat, dust from the road still on his boots. He was looking at the house with the expression of a man doing a routine inspection of a property he owns and has not thought about deeply in some time. There were 2 men with him, estate managers, by the look of them, and he was speaking to one of them in a low voice while the other made notes. He had not seen her yet. Clara had approximately 4 seconds to make a decision. She could straighten up, announce herself, make the moment deliberate. She stayed exactly where she was. He turned eventually, because people doing inspections of gardens tend to look at gardens, and found her standing in the middle of the rose bed with dirty hands and a loose strand of hair across her face, and an expression she was working very hard to keep entirely neutral. He looked at her with the same assessing quality he had shown in the Harcastle ballroom, that rapid, comprehensive look, and this time she watched something cross his face that had not been there before. Uncertainty. He did not recognize her. She could see it, the slight pause, the recalibration. She was out of context. A woman in a garden on his estate, clearly not a servant by her dress but not immediately placeable either. "Good morning," he said, in the tone of a man who is not accustomed to people being in his gardens without introduction. Are you the tenant?" "I am one of them," Clara said. "Miss Vane, my father is Baron Vane." Something moved across his face, a flicker, the name landing somewhere. "Miss Vane," he repeated. "Your Grace," she said. She said it the way she said everything, evenly, without warmth or hostility, simply as a fact. And then she turned back to the rose canes, because she was not finished, and there was no reason on earth she should stop what she was doing simply because the Duke of Ashford had arrived to inspect his own property. Behind her, she heard one of the estate managers murmur something. She heard James Caldwell not respond. After a moment, she heard his footsteps continue toward the house. She kept her eyes on the roses until she was certain he was inside. Then she sat back on her heels and let out a long, slow breath. He was gone by early afternoon. Mrs. Peel came to find Clara in the parlor before leaving for the day and mentioned, in the careful way of someone choosing words thoughtfully, that His Grace had found everything satisfactory, and that there was nothing that required the tenant's particular attention. "Thank you, Mrs. Peel," Clara said. The housekeeper paused at the door. She was a stout, practical woman of about 60 who had worked for the Ashford estate for most of her adult life. She had, in Clara's experience, very little interest in things that were not her business. She paused for a little longer than necessary. "He asked who had been working on the kitchen garden," she said, without turning around. "I told him it was you." Clara looked up from her book. "He didn't say anything after that," Mrs. Peel added, "just nodded." Another pause, but he looked back at it as he was leaving, twice. She left before Clara could answer. Clara sat for a while with her book open on her lap, and the fire settling in the grate, and the autumn dark coming down outside the window. She thought about those two words twice, and what they might mean, and then she made herself stop thinking about them because it didn't matter, because it was nothing. Because the Duke of Ashford could look at her garden as many times as he liked and it would not change a single thing about who he was or what he had said or the way her father had laughed. She turned the page. Outside, the wind moved through the fields. Somewhere in the village, a dog barked once and then was quiet. She found the letter 3 days later. It had been left with Mrs. Peel, not addressed to Clara specifically, but to the tenants of Wren Cottage, which had the particular quality of meaning her father but having been written for her. She knew it as soon as she saw the handwriting, something in the formality of it, the precision. It was from Margaret Caldwell, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford. "Dear Miss Vane," it began, so it was for her specifically after all. "You will perhaps remember a brief conversation at the Harcastle ball last spring. I remember it very well. I come to Thornfield each November, as I have done for 30 years. I would be very pleased if you would take tea with me on the 14th. I think we may find we have more to discuss than that evening might have suggested." Clara read it twice. Then she sat down. The woman in gray silk, the hand on her arm, don't waste those eyes on him. Not yet. She had assumed in the months since that the woman had been a stranger, someone who had noticed, someone kind, someone she would never see again. She had not followed the thread of it, had not let herself. James Caldwell's grandmother, who had been watching her, she had said, for some time, longer than that night. Clara set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a long time. Then she went to the writing desk, took out a sheet of paper and wrote her reply. "Dear Lady Ashford, I would be very glad to take tea on the 14th. I thank you for the invitation. Yours sincerely, Clara Vane." She sealed it before she could change her mind. Margaret Caldwell took her tea without milk and her opinions without apology, and Clara liked her immediately. The Dower House sat at the far edge of the Thornfield estate, a smaller, older building than the main house, stone-fronted and ivy-covered, with the settled look of somewhere that had decided long ago exactly what it was, and had no interest in being anything else. Clara arrived at 3 o'clock on the 14th, was shown in by a young maid who seemed slightly afraid of everything, and found the Dowager Duchess already seated by the fire with a pot of tea and the expression of a woman who had been waiting, and did not intend to pretend otherwise. "You came," the old woman said. "You invited me," Clara said. Margaret Caldwell smiled, a small, sharp thing, more acknowledgement than warmth. "Sit down, Miss Vane." Clara sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. The fire was generous. Outside the windows the November fields were gray and still. The maid poured the tea with slightly trembling hands and then disappeared with evident relief. "You didn't tell anyone you knew who I was," Clara said. "At the ball." "No." "Why?" "Because the moment was not right." Margaret lifted her cup. "And because I wanted to see what you would do without the knowledge." Clara looked at her steadily. "And what did I do?" "You held your head up," the old woman said. "And you didn't cry. And you didn't make a scene, which would have been understandable but would also have been the end of you in that room." She paused. "And you walked away at exactly the right pace. That told me more than anything else." Clara was quiet for a moment. It told you that I was good at hiding things. It told me, Margaret said precisely, that you understood that some battles are not won in the moment they begin. She set her cup down. That is a rarer quality than you might think, Miss Vane, particularly in a woman of your age in that situation with that audience. Clara looked at the fire. I was very angry. I know that was obvious too. A pause, but you chose what to do with it, that is the point. They met every Tuesday after that. It was not discussed or formally arranged after the first time. It simply became the pattern, the way certain things do when two people find each other mutually useful and are both too practical to pretend otherwise. Clara would arrive at 3. The trembling maid would pour the tea. Margaret would be already seated. They talked about everything. Not in the circling, careful way Clara was accustomed to with women of Margaret's generation and position. That particular style of conversation that managed to cover great distances while never actually landing anywhere. Margaret had apparently decided, at some point in her long life, that she had no more time for that, and Clara found the directness so refreshing it was almost disorienting. They talked about books. Margaret had strong opinions about novels and stronger ones about the people who dismissed them. They talked about the estate and the village and the particular social architecture of the county. They talked, occasionally and carefully, about James. Not much, not directly, but enough. Clara learned that he had been different before his father died. That the title had come to him at 23, too young, at a moment when he had not yet finished becoming whatever he had been in the process of becoming. That he had hardened in ways that Margaret did not entirely approve of and felt partially responsible for. I indulged him, she said once without particular emotion. After his father died, I thought grief required softness. I was wrong. Softness without structure produces something else entirely. Clara did not ask what that something was. She thought she already knew. James Caldwell returned to Thornfield in the second week of December. He did not come alone. Lady Cecily Montrose arrived in a carriage that was more expensive than anything Thornfield had seen that season, wearing a fur-trimmed traveling coat and an expression of polite boredom that Clara recognized as the specific expression of beautiful women in places that do not interest them. She was 24, dark-haired, fine-featured, and possessed of the kind of effortless elegance that is less a quality than a weapon. She was also, the village established within approximately 4 hours of her arrival, James Caldwell's intended. Nothing official, no announcement, but the way he handed her down from the carriage, the way the household staff arranged itself around her presence, the particular quality of the space between them that said, to anyone paying attention, that something had been decided even if it had not yet been said aloud. Clara heard about it from Mrs. Peel, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of someone who had formed an opinion and chosen not to share it. Lady Cecily Montrose, Clara said. Yes, miss. I see, Clara said. She went back to her book. She told herself with some firmness that it was entirely irrelevant to her. James Caldwell's romantic arrangements had nothing whatsoever to do with Clara Vane. She was a tenant on his estate. She took tea with his grandmother on Tuesdays. That was the full extent of it. She had no claim on him, had never wanted one, and the fact that the news of Lady Cecily's arrival had produced a particular tightness somewhere below her ribs was simply nothing. Indigestion, possibly. She was very firm about this for approximately 3 days. She met Lady Cecily on the 4th day, at the village church, where Clara had gone to return a book to the vicar's wife, and Lady Cecily had apparently gone, because James had some business with the vicar, and she had come along, and was now standing in the churchyard looking at the gravestones with the expression of someone who has run out of ways to appear occupied. Clara would have walked past. She had every intention of walking past. Lady Cecily turned at the sound of footsteps and looked at her. You're the tenant, she said, from the cottage. Not unkindly, simply as a statement of fact, the way one might identify a piece of furniture. The tenant from the cottage, that is what she was. Miss Vane, Clara said, yes. Lady Cecily looked at her with frank, unhurried assessment. It was not the same look James had given her in the ballroom. There was no cruelty in it, exactly, but it had a similar quality of finding and filing. Clara felt herself being measured against some internal standard, and suspected she came up slightly short. "He mentioned you," Lady Cecily said. Clara kept her expression entirely still. "Did he?" "He said you'd been working on the kitchen garden, that it looked considerably better." A small pause. "He seemed, I don't know, thoughtful about it." She said the word thoughtful with the faint air of someone describing an unexpected weather pattern. Clara said nothing. "How long have you been here?" Lady Cecily asked. "Since October." "And before that, London?" "Yes." "Did you know him in London?" Clara looked at her directly. "We were briefly introduced, at the Harcastle ball last spring." Something moved across Lady Cecily's face, a small recalibration. Recognition, perhaps, of a name or an occasion, or simply the refiling of Clara into a different category. "I see," she said. Then James came out of the church and saw them both, and the conversation ended in the particular way conversations end, when the person they were about appears without warning. He looked at Clara with an expression she could not entirely read. Not discomfort, something more complicated than that. Something that involved, she thought, the very slight awareness of a man who has said something that cannot be unsaid and finds himself standing in front of it again. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she said. And then she excused herself and walked home, and did not look back, and was proud of herself for it. 3 days before Christmas, the snow came. It came properly, not the hesitant dusting that the south of England usually managed and called winter, but real snow, the kind that settled and stayed, that changed the shape of everything overnight, and made the world briefly quiet in a way that even people who had lived through many winters found unexpectedly moving. Clara woke to it and stood at the bedroom window for a long time just looking. Then she put on her warmest coat and went outside. She was not the only one. Half the village, it seemed, had come out for the same reason, the particular compulsion that snow produces in people who have been waiting out a gray November and need to mark the change. Children had appeared from nowhere. Someone had already begun clearing the lane. Old Mr. Fenwick's wife stood in her doorway watching with her hands pressed together in front of her face soft in a way Clara had not seen before. Clara was helping Mrs. Hatch clear the path in front of the bakery when she heard it. A shout, then more shouting, then the particular sound of alarm that a crowd makes when something has shifted from ordinary to urgent. She turned. At the far end of the lane, one of the estate's working horses had slipped on the ice. It was down on its side. One of the younger stable hands tangled with it in a panic, and the horse was struggling in the way that frightened animals struggle, all muscle and terror, making everything worse. 2 men were trying to help and managing mostly to increase the chaos. A small crowd had gathered at a careful distance, unsure, doing nothing. Clara was moving before she had consciously decided to move. She had grown up in better years with horses. She did not think about this. She simply went to the horse's head, got down in the snow beside it, put both hands on its neck and started talking. Not to the men, not to the crowd, to the horse. Low, steady, meaningless words delivered in a tone that said, without saying it, "You are safe. Nothing is required of you. I am here. Be still." The horse was not still immediately. It took several minutes, but it stopped fighting. "Get his legs free," she said to the stable hand who was staring at her. "Slowly, don't rush it." He did what she said. By the time the horse was on its feet again, trembling but upright and unhurt, the crowd had grown considerably. Clara became aware of this gradually, of the ring of people, the silence, the watching. She became aware, specifically, of James Caldwell standing at the edge of the crowd. He was completely still. He had been there for some portion of it, she didn't know how long. He was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not the assessing look, not the polished social surface, something quieter than both. Something that looked almost like a man revising something he had previously believed. Clara stood up, brushed the snow from her coat, handed the horse's lead to the stable hand. Then she looked at James Caldwell across the space between them, and she held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be deliberate, short enough to mean nothing. And she turned and went back to Mrs. Hatch's path. She picked up the shovel and kept clearing. Behind her, she heard the crowd begin to disperse. She heard voices, low and then lower. She did not hear James say anything. She did not hear his footsteps. But she was aware, in the particular way that she was becoming accustomed to being aware of him, that he did not leave immediately. He stayed for a while longer, in the cold and the quiet and the white. Lady Cecily knocked on the cottage door on the 23rd of December. Clara answered it herself. The housekeeper had gone home. Her father was out, and found Lady Cecily on the step in her expensive coat with an expression that was trying, not entirely successfully, to be pleasant. "Miss Vane," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Clara said. "Would you like to come in?" Lady Cecily came in. She looked around the cottage parlor with the careful attention of someone collecting information. Clara offered tea. Lady Cecily accepted, sat down, and held her cup without drinking from it. "I'll be direct," she said. "Please," Clara said. "He talks about you." Clara said nothing. Not in a way that is obvious," Lady Cecily said. "He doesn't speak of you directly, but you come up. The garden, the horse. The Tuesday teas with his grandmother." She paused. "Margaret likes you. That in itself is she doesn't like many people." "I like her," Clara said simply. "James doesn't know what to do with you," Lady Cecily said. She said it without particular emotion, as an observation, almost clinical. "He's used to people who want something from him, who perform a certain way. You don't perform." Clara looked at her. "Lady Cecily, why are you telling me this?" A long pause. Lady Cecily set her cup down with a small, precise click. When she looked up, her expression had shifted into something Clara hadn't seen on her face before. Something that was not polished or assessing or bored. Something that was, unexpectedly, a little tired. "Because I think you should know what you're dealing with," she said quietly. "And because," she stopped, started again. "He is not a bad man, Miss Vane, he is a careless one. There is a difference, but the difference is not always enough." She stood up, smoothed her coat. "Thank you for the tea," she said, and she left. Clara sat alone in the parlor for a long time after that, with the fire and the snow outside and Lady Cecily's words sitting in the room like a third presence. He is not a bad man. He is a careless one. She thought about that. She thought about a ballroom, 7 words, her father's laugh. She thought about a garden, and a horse in the snow, and the particular quality of a man staying when he could have left. She thought about Margaret Caldwell's voice. "Don't waste those eyes on him. Not yet." The fire settled. The snow fell. Clara picked up her book, opened it to the right page, and found she could not read a single word. January in Wiltshire was not forgiving. The snow that had arrived so beautifully in December hardened into something less poetic in the new year, gray ice on the lanes, frost that didn't lift until mid-morning, cold that settled into stone walls and stayed there regardless of how many fires you kept burning. The days were short, and the nights were long, and the world contracted to the distance you could comfortably walk before your hands stopped working properly. Clara found she didn't mind it. There was something honest about January. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. She respected that. She had spent the last week of December and the 1st of January in a state of deliberate ordinariness, tending the garden where she could, reading, walking, taking her Tuesday teas with Margaret, helping where the village needed helping. She had not seen James Caldwell since the morning of the snow. She understood he had returned to London for the new year, Lady Cecily presumably with him, and the estate had settled back into its quieter rhythms. She was glad he was gone. She told herself this several times and found, on balance, that she mostly believed it. Margaret was in a particular mood on the 2nd Tuesday of January. Clara noticed it immediately. The way the old woman was seated when she arrived, not in her usual chair by the fire but at the writing desk near the window, looking out at the frozen garden with an expression Clara hadn't seen on her before. Not sad, exactly. Something older than sad. "Are you well?" Clara asked. "Perfectly," Margaret said. Then after a pause, "No, sit down." Clara sat. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a crow landed on the garden wall, looked at nothing in particular and flew away again. "His father would have liked you," Margaret said. Clara went still. Robert James's father, he had a way of seeing people, the real shape of them underneath all the performance. Margaret's voice was even, measured. He would have seen you in about 30 seconds, and he would have approved. Clara didn't know what to say to this. She said nothing, which was frequently the right answer with Margaret. "He died badly," Margaret said. "Not the death itself, that was quick enough, but everything before it. The estate was in trouble. He had made certain decisions, trusted certain people he should not have trusted. By the time James inherited, there was considerably less than anyone understood." A pause. "James was 23. He handled it. He handled it very well in the financial sense. In the other sense," she stopped. "He hardened," Clara said quietly. Margaret looked at her. "Yes." Another silence. The fire was generous. The crow was gone. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. "Because you deserve to understand what you're looking at," Margaret said. "And because I am old and I have kept too many things for too long and I am tired of the weight of them." She turned from the window finally and looked at Clara directly. "His father knew your mother, Miss Vane." The room seemed to shift slightly. "They grew up in the same county," Margaret continued in the same measured voice. "Somerset. Your mother's family had been there for generations, the Ashworths, old blood, older than most people remember." She paused. "Robert loved her. Before he loved anyone else, he loved your mother. They were very young. It came to nothing. Her family had difficulties. She was sent away. He was pushed toward a more suitable arrangement." The slight compression around the word suitable said everything about what she thought of that. "He married James's mother. Your mother married your father, and life proceeded in the way life does." Clara's hands were very still in her lap. "Your mother wrote to me once," Margaret said, "after James was born, a brief letter congratulating me on the grandchild, nothing more, but she mentioned you. You would have been about a year old." A small pause. "She said you had her eyes." Clara said nothing. "She died 3 years later," Margaret said gently. "I know, I heard. I thought about writing to your father, but I didn't know him and I didn't know what good it would do." She looked at Clara with her sharp, dark eyes. "And then last spring I saw you walk into the Harcastle ballroom, and I saw those eyes, and I knew immediately." Clara let out a breath she had been holding without realizing it. "What are you telling me?" she said carefully. "I am telling you that I have a small box that belonged to your mother. She sent it to me for safekeeping, some years before she died. Letters and some documents relating to the Ashworth family. I have kept it because I didn't know what else to do with it, and because I thought it might matter someday." Margaret stood slowly, with the careful economy of movement of someone who knows what their body costs them, and went to the writing desk. She opened the bottom drawer and removed a small wooden box, dark with age, and brought it to Clara. "I should have given you this sooner," she said, "but I wanted to know you first. I needed to know you were ready for it." Clara looked at the box in her hands. It was lighter than she expected. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something she couldn't name that was nonetheless immediately familiar, in the way that certain smells reach somewhere deeper than memory. "What's in it?" she asked. "Read it in your own time," Margaret said. "Not here, at home when you're alone." She sat back down. "But I will tell you this much, your mother was the last legitimate daughter of the Ashworth line. The documents establish it clearly. You carry a bloodline, Miss Vane, that predates half the titles in this county by 200 years. Clara looked up. "Including," Margaret said, with the particular precision of someone placing a final piece, "the Ashford dukedom." She carried the box home under her arm in the January cold and put it on the table in the parlor and looked at it for a long time without opening it. Then she made tea, drank it, looked at the box some more. Then she opened it. She read for 3 hours. Her mother's handwriting was smaller than she expected, precise and slightly slanted. The letters were not dramatic. They were practical, factual, the letters of a woman dealing methodically with what needed dealing with. Land records, family documents, a letter from a solicitor, a brief note written separately, addressed to no one in particular, that said simply, "For Clara, when she is old enough to know what to do with it." Clara sat with that note for a long time. She was 22 years old. She didn't entirely know what to do with any of it, but she understood the shape of it, the legal weight, the quiet significance. She was not nobody. She had never been nobody. She had simply never had the papers to prove what her blood already knew. She folded everything carefully and put it back in the box and sat with the fire until it burned low. Then she went to bed and lay awake for several hours, thinking about a ballroom in April and 7 words and the sound of her father's laugh. James Caldwell returned to Thornfield in the 3rd week of January. He came alone this time. No Lady Cecily, no estate managers. Just him and his horse and the particular atmosphere of a man who has spent some weeks in a city being social and has arrived in the countryside because he needs to remember how to breathe. Clara learned of his arrival as she learned most things from Mrs. Peel, mentioned in passing without emphasis while discussing an unrelated matter about the parlor grate. She registered it, set it aside, continued her week. On Thursday afternoon, she was walking the long field path back from the village when she heard hoofbeats behind her, and then beside her, and then James Caldwell was there on a gray horse, slowing to her pace with the slightly deliberate air of a man who has made a decision and is committed to it now. "Miss Vane," he said. "Your Grace," she said, and kept walking. He rode alongside her in silence for a moment. The field was gray and frozen. The sky was the low, flat white of a January afternoon running out of light. "The garden looks well," he said, "even now." "The structure holds in winter," Clara said, "if it's planned properly." Another silence. "I wanted to speak with you," he said. "You are speaking with me." A pause, something shifted in his expression, a slight tightening, a recalibration. He was not accustomed, she suspected, to this particular brand of unhelpfulness. Most people smoothed the way for him, anticipated, made things easier. Clara walked at her own pace and waited. "That evening," he said, "at the Harcastle ball." "Yes," she said simply. "I was—" He stopped, started again. The words were arriving with the effortful quality of something being moved from one place to another that has been in the original place for a long time. "I was not at my best that evening." Clara walked 3 more steps before she answered. "No," she said, "you were exactly yourself." She felt him absorb that, watched it in her peripheral vision, the slight stillness, the thing that moved behind his eyes. "That is a harsh assessment," he said quietly. "Is it inaccurate?" A long pause. "No," he said, and the word had a different quality than anything else he had said, quieter, less managed. "No, I don't think it is." Clara looked at him then, directly, for the first time since this conversation had begun. He looked tired, she noticed. Not the exhaustion of a man who hadn't slept, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from carrying something for long enough that you've stopped noticing the weight and started noticing only the ache. She almost said something that would have been kinder than what she actually said. "An acknowledgement is not the same as an apology," she said instead. "And an apology is not the same as understanding why it needed to happen. I don't require any of them from you, Your Grace, but I thought you should know the difference." She stopped walking. They were at the point where the path forked, one way toward the cottage, one way toward the estate. She turned to him, and something in her expression apparently told him that this was the end of the conversation, because he didn't try to extend it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, a single, precise inclination of his head that was not the social gesture she was accustomed to from him, but something more like genuinely meant. "Good evening, Miss Vane," he said. "Good evening," she said. She took the path toward the cottage. She did not look back. But she heard him stay there for a moment before the hoofbeats finally moved away, and she pressed her lips together against something that was not quite a smile and was not quite anything else either, and she walked home in the last of the January light. It was Lady Cecily who told her. Not directly. Lady Cecily had returned to Thornfield the following week, and the dynamic between her and Clara had shifted into something cautious and not unfriendly, a careful mutual acknowledgement of a complicated situation that neither of them had entirely chosen. They met occasionally at the village or at Margaret's, and they spoke with the slightly guarded civility of two people who respect each other enough to be honest, and are uncertain how much honesty the situation can bear. It was at Margaret's on a Tuesday that Lady Cecily arrived unexpectedly mid-afternoon, which she had never done before, with high color in her cheeks and an expression that Clara recognized, with a small, cold, settling sensation in her stomach, as the expression of someone who has come to deliver something they have decided needs delivering. Margaret looked between them and found a reason to leave the room. Lady Cecily sat down. She did not take off her coat. "There is something you should know," she said, "and I am telling you because I think you deserve to hear it before it changes things." Clara waited. "Someone in the village, I don't know who, it doesn't matter, told James that they had seen you walking toward the Miller farm last week, in the late afternoon." A pause. "Thomas Miller's son has recently returned from abroad. He is considered quite handsome, I understand, and—" "I brought Mrs. Miller a remedy for her cough," Clara said. Her voice was very level. "Her son was not there. I was there for 20 minutes. Lady Cecily closed her eyes briefly. "I know." "And James believed it." A silence. He didn't say he believed it," Lady Cecily said carefully. "He said nothing directly, but I know him and I saw his face and—" She stopped. "Yes, he believed it, or let himself believe it, which is perhaps worse." Clara stood up. She moved to the window and looked out at Margaret's frozen garden, and she breathed very carefully, in and out, the way she had learned to breathe in ballrooms and difficult parlors, and every room where she was required to be something other than what she felt. The anger was clean and cold, not the hot, blurring kind. The other kind, the kind that arrives when something happens that you had, in some honest corner of yourself, been waiting to happen. Because she should have known. He had stood on a path in January and said I was not at my best, and she had been. She had almost allowed herself to. "Miss Vane," Lady Cecily said quietly. "I'm sorry." Clara turned around. She looked at Lady Cecily, at this woman who had come here, to a place she didn't need to be, to say a thing she hadn't needed to say, because she had decided it was the right thing to do. "Thank you," Clara said, "for telling me." Lady Cecily nodded. She stood, smoothed her coat, moved toward the door. Then she paused with her hand on the frame and said quietly, almost to herself, "He doesn't deserve you. I think he knows that. I think that's rather the problem." She left. Margaret reappeared from wherever she had been, settled herself into her chair, and poured fresh tea without comment. Clara sat back down. She picked up her cup. "I know," Margaret said. "You knew he'd heard the story." "I knew something like it would happen eventually," Margaret said. "Men like James, they reach for reasons. When they're frightened of something, they reach for reasons to step back from it." She paused. "It doesn't make it acceptable." "No," Clara agreed. "It doesn't." She drank her tea. She thought about the box on the parlor table at the cottage, about her mother's handwriting, about the words for Clara when she is old enough to know what to do with it. She was beginning, she thought, to understand what to do with it. Not yet, but soon. She wrote to Margaret that evening. Not about the box, not yet, but about London, about the coming season, about the possibility of returning in the spring. Margaret replied the next morning in 3 lines. "Come to London in April, stay at my house in Mayfair, bring the box, it is time." Spring came to Wiltshire the way it always did, gradually, then all at once. One morning, the fields were still the flat gray-brown of winter, and then almost without transition there was green in the hedgerows and light in the afternoons, and the kitchen garden was pushing up the first tentative shoots of everything Clara had planted in the autumn. She stood among them on a morning in late March and felt something she couldn't entirely name, a mix of satisfaction and something more complicated, the feeling of a person who has built something good in a place they are about to leave. She had told her father they were returning to London for the season. He had been relieved in the way that men are relieved when someone else makes a decision they had been avoiding making themselves. He had not asked why. He had not asked about the arrangements or the expense or where they would stay. He had simply nodded and said quite right, and gone back to his cards. Clara had made the arrangements herself. Margaret's house in Mayfair was tall and cream-fronted and situated on a quiet street that nonetheless managed to be exactly in the center of everything that mattered during the season. The staff were efficient and discreet. Clara's room overlooked a small walled garden. Everything was, in the particular language of Margaret Caldwell, precisely as it needed to be and nothing more. They arrived on the 7th of April. On the 8th, Clara visited her mother's solicitor. The solicitor's name was Mr. Graves, and he had the look of a man who had spent 40 years in a profession that required him to know things he was not permitted to say, which had given him a particular quality of watchful stillness. He received Clara in a small wood-paneled office and listened to everything she said without interrupting, and then he looked at the documents from the box for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. "Miss Vane," he said, "do you understand what these establish?" "I believe so," Clara said. "I would like to hear you say it plainly." He said it plainly. She listened. She asked 3 questions. He answered all of them. She thanked him, took the documents back, returned them carefully to the box, and walked out into the April morning feeling the specific sensation of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally understood that they are allowed to set it down. She didn't set it down yet, she wasn't ready, but she understood now that she could. That was enough for now. London in April was London in April, all performance and negotiation, all careful surfaces and rapid assessment, the great seasonal machinery of society turning itself back on after the winter with the cheerful ruthlessness of something that has never doubted its own importance. Clara moved through it differently than she had the previous year. She couldn't have explained precisely what had changed. Her dress was not more expensive. Margaret had offered and Clara had declined with thanks. Her circumstances were not publicly altered. She had done nothing yet with the documents, had said nothing, had made no moves. But something had settled in her, some final accommodation between who she was and who she had been told she was, and the two things no longer pulled against each other. She was simply herself, clearly, without apology, without the careful smallness she had once used as a kind of armor. People noticed. Not in the dramatic way of novels where a transformation is announced. In the quieter, more unsettling way of real life, where someone who was previously easy to overlook becomes, without obvious reason, difficult to ignore. Invitations arrived. Introductions were made. Conversations that would previously have ended in polite dismissal extended themselves, gained interest, went somewhere. Margaret watched all of this with the satisfaction of a person who has planted something in good soil and is waiting, without impatience, for it to grow. She saw James at the Ashworth Musicale on the 3rd Friday of April. She had known he would be there. Margaret had mentioned it with studied casualness the previous Tuesday, which Clara understood to be Margaret's version of a warning. She had prepared herself accordingly. She had a plan, which was not a plan exactly but more of an intention, to be exactly herself, to want nothing from him, to require nothing, to be entirely and completely fine. She was fine. She was completely fine when he walked in with Lady Cecily on his arm. They had apparently resolved whatever had or hadn't been between them into something official, or near enough. She was fine when he scanned the room in the automatic way of people accustomed to knowing everyone present and found her face among the others. She was fine when something moved across his expression at the sight of her. She catalogued it without allowing herself to interpret it, which was a skill she had been practicing since January. She was fine through the entire first half of the musicale. During the interval, she was standing near the windows with a glass of champagne. She wasn't drinking when he appeared beside her. "Miss Vane." "Your Grace." He stood next to her looking out at the garden below. He was close enough that she was aware of him in that specific way she had been trying, with mixed success, to stop being aware of him. "You look well," he said. "Thank you. London suits you this season." "London is London," she said. "I suit myself." A pause. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara turned to look at him. He was looking straight ahead, out the window, with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something, and is discovering that the rehearsal was inadequate preparation for the actual moment. "The story about the Miller farm," he said quietly. "I was told I allowed myself to—" He stopped, tried again. "I should not have entertained it for a moment. It was beneath both of us, and I am sorry." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had said to him in January. An acknowledgement is not the same as an apology, and she noted that this was, technically, an apology. She noted the effort of it. She noted that he was not looking at her while he said it, which was either the discomfort of genuine remorse or the discomfort of a man unaccustomed to apologizing, and she wasn't entirely certain which. She thought about Lady Cecily saying, "He didn't deserve you," with that quiet, tired certainty. She thought about the box. "Why did you believe it?" she said. He turned to look at her now. "Because it was easier," she said simply before he could answer. "Because you were frightened of something and it was easier to have a reason to step back." She held his gaze without anger. She had moved past the anger, which was either growth or loss, and she hadn't decided which. "You believed it because deep down, Your Grace, some part of you still thinks I am what you said I was that night. Someone who can be dismissed. Someone whose version of events is always less credible than the alternative." The silence between them had a particular quality. Not hostile. Something more uncomfortable than hostility. The specific discomfort of a true thing being said in a room where true things are not usually said. "That's not," he started. "I'm not angry," she said. I'm not anymore, but I need you to understand what you did, and I don't think you do yet. I think you understand that you were wrong. I don't think you understand why it was wrong." She paused. "There is a difference." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the polished duke, not the careful London gentleman. Something stripped of all that, something younger and less certain and almost honest. "You're right," he said quietly. I'm not sure I do understand, but I want to." Clara looked at him. She believed him. That was the terrible thing. She looked at his face in that moment and she believed him completely, and she hated how much she believed him, and she hated what it meant that she cared whether he meant it or not. "Then think about it," she said, carefully, without deciding in advance what the answer is. She moved away from the window. She did not look back. She was leaving London. She had decided this before the evening was over, not dramatically, not as a retreat, but as a practical matter. She had done what she needed to do in London. She had seen the solicitor. She had been seen. She had allowed herself to exist in this city on her own terms for the first time, and it had been important, and it was now enough. Margaret had understood without being told. "Next week?" she asked on Tuesday morning. "Thursday," Clara said. Margaret nodded. She poured the tea. She did not ask questions. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the way they always did. Then Margaret said, without preamble, "He came to see me yesterday." Clara was still. "He asked about you. Not directly. James never asks anything directly. It's one of his least endearing qualities. But he asked." Margaret set down her cup. "I told him you were leaving Thursday." "What did he say?" "Nothing immediately." A pause. "Then he said he had made a considerable number of mistakes." Clara looked at the fire. "He has," she said. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "He has." Another pause, smaller this time. He also asked very carefully whether the mistakes were of the kind that could be addressed. The words sat in the room between them. Clara let it sit there for a while. "What did you tell him?" she said finally. Margaret looked at her with those sharp, dark eyes that had missed nothing in 82 years, and did not intend to start now. I told him, Margaret said, that was entirely up to you. He came to the house on Wednesday evening. Clara was in the upstairs sitting room when the bell rang, and she heard voices in the hall, James's voice, low and even, and the butler's careful reply. She heard footsteps on the stairs, then a knock. She opened the door. He was standing in the corridor looking like a man who has arrived somewhere without being entirely certain he should have come, which was an expression she had never seen on him before and which was, against all her better judgment, entirely disarming. "I know you're leaving tomorrow," he said. "Yes." "I needed to," he stopped, started again. "May I come in?" She stepped back from the door. He came in. He stood in the middle of the sitting room and looked at her with the expression of a man who has prepared something and has now forgotten all of it. "I have been trying to understand," he said. "What you said at the Ashworth musicale. You were right, I did understand that I was wrong. I didn't understand why." He paused. "I think I do now, or I'm beginning to." Clara said nothing. She waited. "I have spent a long time," he said carefully, "treating people as categories rather than as themselves. It was easier. After my father died, it was considerably easier. And you?" He stopped again. Something moved across his face, difficult to read, stripped of the usual polish. "You have never fit any category I had, from the beginning. And instead of simply looking at you clearly, I chose the categories, every time, even when you showed me something different." He looked at her directly. "The ballroom, the garden, the snow. Every time you showed me something different, I chose the easier interpretation, because the other one," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Clara stood very still in the middle of Margaret's sitting room with the London evening coming in through the windows and looked at James Caldwell, and she felt many things. Too many things, arriving all at once, which was inconvenient and unfair and entirely predictable, because she had known for some time that this was coming, and had not managed to sufficiently prepare. "The other one required something from you," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "And you weren't certain you could give it." "I wasn't certain I deserved to." The room was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything, the ballroom, the snow, the solicitor's office, her mother's handwriting for Clara, when she is old enough to know what to do with it. She thought about how much she had become in the past year, in the quiet of Wiltshire and the careful company of Margaret and the slow work of a neglected garden. She thought about who she had been before all of it, standing at the edge of a ballroom trying to take up as little space as possible. She was not that person anymore. And she would not, she told herself this with great firmness, she would not give this man anything he had not earned. "I am going home tomorrow," she said. Something in his face fell slightly. "But I will be at the Pemberton dinner next week," she continued. "If you are there." He looked at her. "I'm not telling you that I forgive you," she said clearly. "I'm not telling you that anything is resolved or settled. I am telling you that I will be at the Pemberton dinner. What you do with that is your concern." He nodded slowly. "I'll be there." "Good." She moved to open the door. He walked to it, stopped just at the threshold and turned to look at her one more time. With that expression, the honest one, the one she was beginning to understand was the most real thing about him. "Miss Vane," he said, "for what it's worth, I have known since January what I said that night at the Harcastle ball." He paused. "I have known since January that it was the stupidest thing I have ever said, and I have said a considerable number of stupid things." Clara looked at him. "That," she said, "is a beginning." She closed the door. She stood in the quiet sitting room for a long moment with her hand still on the door handle, and she allowed herself, just for a moment, just in the privacy of this room, to close her eyes. Then she went to finish packing. The Pemberton dinner was the kind of event that London society took seriously without admitting it took seriously. 40 covers, the right 40, in a dining room designed to make everyone present feel simultaneously privileged and observed. The food was excellent. The conversation was carefully managed. Everything meant something, and everyone knew it. Clara arrived with Margaret. This was, she understood, not a neutral choice. Margaret Caldwell arriving anywhere with anyone was a statement. The old woman had been a fixed point in London society for 60 years, and her proximity to a person functioned as a kind of endorsement that no amount of money could purchase and no social maneuvering could replicate. Clara had not asked for it. Margaret had simply appeared at the foot of the stairs at 7 o'clock and said, "Shall we go?" in the tone of a woman who has already decided. Clara had put on her coat. The room received them. There was no other word for it. Not dramatically, not with the obvious turning of heads that happened in novels, but Clara felt it, the shift in register, the recalibration, the quiet and rapid reassessment that moved through the room like a current under still water. She had been here before in various forms, and it had always felt like walking into judgment. Tonight it felt like something else. She wasn't entirely sure what. She looked for James immediately, which she had told herself she would not do. He was already looking at her. He was standing near the fireplace with two other men, a glass in his hand, and he had turned the moment she entered. Not the automatic social scan she was accustomed to from him, but something more deliberate than that. More prepared, as though he had been waiting and had known the exact moment to look. Their eyes met across the room. Clara held his gaze for 3 seconds, then turned to speak with Lady Pemberton. Dinner was 12 courses in 2 hours, and the particular kind of social endurance sport that Clara had grown up training for without knowing it was training. She was seated at the far end of the table from James, which was either chance or arrangement, and she suspected the latter Margaret's doing, or Lady Pemberton's, or some collaboration between them that Clara had not been consulted about and would not have asked to be. She ate, she talked. She was aware of this happening in real time, which was strange, interesting to people. Not in the desperate way of someone performing interest, but in the genuine way of a person who has things to say and has recently stopped editing them before they arrive. She made 2 people laugh without trying. She disagreed with a gentleman across the table about the management of agricultural estates in a way that produced, rather than offense, a conversation that lasted through 3 courses and ended with him asking for her opinion on something specific. She was aware, distantly, that James could hear portions of this conversation. He was not so far away as all that. She did not look at him. It was after dinner in the drawing room that Lady Cecily found her. Clara had not known Lady Cecily would be here. She processed the surprise quickly, filed it, neutralized it, and offered a genuine enough smile. Lady Cecily did not return it. Not because she was hostile, but because she had the look of someone carrying something uncomfortable and had not yet decided how to put it down. "Walk with me," she said quietly, "away from the room." They found a small sitting room off the corridor, empty, lit by a single lamp on the side table. Lady Cecily closed the door and turned to Clara with the expression Clara had seen once before, that stripped, tired honesty that sat beneath all the polish when Lady Cecily chose to let it show. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need to tell you before anything is decided tonight." Clara waited. "James and I are not engaged," Lady Cecily said. "We never formally were. It was an understanding between families more than between us, something that was expected and assumed and never quite examined." She paused. "We examined it last week, at some length." The room was very quiet. "He told me about Wednesday evening," Lady Cecily continued, "about coming to Margaret's house, about what he said." A pause. "He has never spoken to me the way he apparently spoke to you." Clara looked at her carefully. "I'm not telling you this I'm not asking for your sympathy," Lady Cecily said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm quite all right. I think I have known for some time that what James and I had was comfortable and correct on paper and not quite enough." She said the last part simply, without drama. "He deserves someone who unsettles him. He has needed for a very long time to be unsettled." She looked at Clara steadily. "You unsettle him considerably." Clara said nothing. "What I need to tell you," Lady Cecily said, "is about something I overheard last week before James and I spoke. He was with Lord Fenmore. You don't know Fenmore, it doesn't matter, and Fenmore was asking him about you. About who you were, your family, your situation." She paused. "And Fenmore said something about your father." The quiet in the room changed quality. "What did he say?" Clara said. Lady Cecily met her eyes. "Your father borrowed money from Fenmore last year. A significant amount. He hasn't repaid it." A pause. "Fenmore told James that Baron Vane had approached him about an arrangement, that if Fenmore could secure certain social introductions that might lead to Clara Vane making a favorable match this season, then a portion of the debt might be forgiven." Clara was very still. "He is using your prospects to settle his debts," Lady Cecily said gently. "He may have been doing so for some time." The lamp on the side table flickered. Clara thought about her father's relief when she'd agreed to go to the Harcastle ball. His insistence. There will be opportunities. The way he laughed at James Caldwell's cruelty and called it quite right without once looking at his daughter's face. She thought about the year in Wiltshire. The arrangement that had come through, apparently, via channels her father had been quietly managing. The house on Ashford Land. The proximity. Had any of it been chance? She felt something cold settle in her chest. Not grief, exactly. She had run out of the capacity for grief about her father some years ago. Something more like finality. The closing of a door she had always known was closed but had never quite admitted. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. "Are you?" "I'm quite all right," Clara said. And she was, in the specific sense that she had been preparing for some version of this knowledge her whole life, and the arrival of it, however hard, carried the strange relief of certainty after long suspicion. She stood up. "Lady Cecily," she said, you have been consistently honest with me in circumstances where you had no obligation to be. I won't forget it." Lady Cecily looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, and something in her face softened. "Go back in," she said. "Don't let it show tonight. Deal with it when you're home." Clara nodded. She went back to the drawing room. She dealt with it when she was home. Not that night. That night she sat with it in the dark of her room and simply let it be what it was. The way you sometimes have to let a thing exist before you can decide what to do about it. But the next morning, clear-eyed and cold and entirely certain, she sat down at the writing desk and began. She wrote to Mr. Graves first. Specific instructions, carefully worded. He would understand what she was asking and what she intended. Then she wrote to her father. This letter was shorter. She had thought it would be harder to write. It wasn't, which told her something about how long she had actually known. She told him what she knew. She told him what she intended to do about it. She told him in the final paragraph that she loved him. This was true, in the complicated and exhausted way of a person who loves someone who has never quite deserved it, and that she was no longer available to be used. She sealed both letters and sent them before she changed her mind. Then she went downstairs and had breakfast with Margaret, who looked at her face over the teapot and said nothing, which was exactly right. The Harcastle ball fell on the last Friday of April. A year, exactly, since the evening that had started all of it. Clara had not planned to go. Then she had planned to go as a kind of private marking of the occasion. Then she had decided this was sentimental and she would stay home. Then Margaret had appeared in the doorway of her room at 6:30 and said wear the blue one and left, and Clara had put on the blue one. The ballroom was the same as it had always been, too hot, too bright, too loud. The chandeliers threw the same gold light. The orchestra played at the same end of the room. The same careful performance was happening in all the same corners. Clara stood just inside the entrance and felt very briefly the ghost of how she had stood here a year ago, the careful smallness, the lemonade she hadn't drunk, the 3 careful breaths. Then the ghost passed. She moved into the room. She had been there perhaps 20 minutes in conversation with 2 women she had met at the Pemberton dinner and genuinely liked, when she became aware of a change in the room's atmosphere. Not dramatic, a slight shift, a new current in the social weather. People adjusting, recalibrating the way they do when something has happened that they are all processing simultaneously. She turned. Her father had arrived. He was standing near the entrance with the expression of a man who has received a letter he had not expected and has come here anyway, which told her that he had received her letter and had chosen the response of a man who needed an audience. Baron Vane had always performed better with an audience. She watched him scan the room and find her. She held his gaze. He moved toward her with the particular walk of a man who has decided he is aggrieved, which Clara recognized from childhood, the slightly too upright posture, the expression composed into something between hurt and dignity, the performance of a wound designed to put the other person on the defensive before a word had been spoken. She had spent her entire life on the defensive before her father had finished crossing a room. She waited. He arrived. He took her arm lightly, a social gesture, something anyone watching would read as paternal affection, and said quietly with a smile fixed on his face, "Ellie, we need to discuss this letter." "We can discuss it tomorrow," she said, "at home." "I think." "Tomorrow, father." She removed her arm from his hold, not roughly, simply clearly. "This is not the place." His expression flickered. The composed hurt threatened to shift into something sharper. "Do you have any idea," he said, lower now, "what you are, what this will look like, what people will say when they find out you've gone to a solicitor behind my—" "Behind your what?" she said. He stopped. She looked at him. This man she had spent 22 years making herself smaller for, making herself quieter for, making herself more manageable and less inconvenient for, and she felt, rising up through the cold clarity she had been carrying all week, a clean and simple anger. Not the kind that needed to perform. Not the kind that needed an audience. "Behind my back," he finished, but it had lost something. The air had gone out of it. "I am your daughter," Clara said quietly. "Not a debt instrument, not a social arrangement, not a means of settling your accounts with Lord Fenmore or anyone else." She held his gaze steadily. "I have been patient with you for a very long time, father. I am done being patient, but I am not done being your daughter if you can manage to remember what that means." The silence between them was brief. Then from somewhere behind her a voice, not quiet, not private. "Miss Vane," she turned. James Caldwell was standing 6 feet away. He had clearly been nearby for some portion of this conversation. She could see in his expression that he had heard at least the last of it. He was looking at her with that honest face, the real one, and then he looked at her father with an expression that was not the effortless social performance she was accustomed to from him, but something much more deliberate. "Baron Vane," James said, addressing her father directly in a tone that was perfectly civil and somehow, in its perfect civility, entirely unambiguous. "I believe Miss Vane has said what she needed to say. I wonder if you might give us a moment." Her father looked at James Caldwell, Duke of Ashford, and did the thing he had always done with powerful men. He stepped back. He nodded. He manufactured a smile. He said, of course, and moved away, and Clara watched him go with a feeling she couldn't entirely name, something that was sad and tired, and also, underneath both of those, something lighter. Something that felt like the first breath after a very long time of not quite breathing. James stepped closer. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. And this time, unlike every other time she had said it, she actually was. He reached into his coat, produced a small folded note and held it out to her. "My grandmother asked me to give you this. She said I'd know when." Clara took it, unfolded it, Margaret's handwriting, 3 lines. "It is time for the box. Mr. Graves has what he needs. I suggest Saturday. Wear something that holds up under attention. There will be a great deal of it." Clara looked up. James was watching her with an expression that had moved past polished and past honest into something she hadn't seen before, something open and careful and entirely undefended. "I don't know what's in the note," he said. "She wouldn't tell me." "No," Clara said, "she wouldn't." "But she told me something else," he said. "Last week, About your mother, about your family." He paused. "About what I said in this room a year ago, and what I didn't know and what I should have known regardless." He looked at her steadily. "I owe you a great deal more than an apology, Miss Vane." Clara looked around the room, at the chandeliers, the orchestra, the carefully performing world that had watched her diminished in this place 1 year ago and thought nothing of it. "You owe me a dance," she said. Something crossed his face. Something that started at the edges and moved inward, surprised and then warm and then, finally, unmistakably real. He held out his hand. She looked at it for one long moment. Then she took it. And the orchestra played, and the chandeliers threw their gold light, and Clara Vane walked onto the floor of the Harcastle ballroom on the arm of the Duke of Ashford, and nobody laughed. Nobody laughed at all. The following Saturday, Mr. Graves read the Ashworth documents before a small and carefully selected gathering at Margaret's house in Mayfair. Clara's father was not present. He had received a second letter earlier that week, from Mr. Graves this time, not Clara, and had responded with the silence of a man who has finally understood the shape of something and is deciding whether to argue with it or accept it. He would accept it eventually. Clara knew this. He was not in the end a man who fought things that couldn't be fought. The gathering was small. Margaret, Mr. Graves, 2 witnesses required by the legal process, and James. James had asked to be there. He had asked Clara directly, which she had appreciated. She had said yes. He sat beside her while Mr. Graves spoke, and he did not move, and he did not look away. And when it was over and the room was quiet, he turned to her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, not surprise, because Margaret had told him enough that surprise wasn't possible, but something deeper than surprise, something that was reckoning with its own history. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She looked at him. "I called you plain," he said quietly, "in a room full of people, and your father laughed." He stopped. "And you were all of this. You were all of this the entire time, and I—" "James," she said. He stopped. "I know," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the particular care of a man handling something he understands to be significant, he reached across and covered her hand with his. She let him. Outside, London went about its business in the April morning, entirely indifferent to the small room on the quiet Mayfair street where 2 people were sitting in the ruins of a year's worth of mistakes, figuring out together how to begin. 2 years later, the mornings were the best part. Clara had decided this sometime in the first autumn, that the mornings at Ashford Park belonged to her in a way that nothing else quite did. Before the house fully woke, before the staff began their careful orchestration of the day, before letters arrived, and decisions needed making and the world remembered it had opinions about things. In those first quiet hours, the house was simply itself. Stone and light and the sound of birds in the elm trees along the east lawn. She came downstairs early, as she always did. The kitchen garden was visible from the back corridor window, considerably larger now than anything she had managed at Wren Cottage, and considerably better planned, though she had kept certain elements she had first tried in Wiltshire. The climbing roses were her particular pride. They had taken well to the south-facing wall, and had spent their first summer doing exactly what she had hoped, which was more than could be said for most things one hoped for. She went to the small sitting room off the library, her room, specifically hers, which she had arranged exactly as she wanted and which James had not once suggested should be otherwise. And she sat in the chair by the window, and she had her tea in the early light, and she read. This was the morning. This was hers. After a while she heard him on the stairs. He was not a quiet person in the mornings, not deliberately loud, but constitutionally incapable of the particular stealth she managed without trying. She heard him in the corridor, heard the slight pause outside the sitting-room door, heard the knock that he still gave every single time despite the fact that she had told him on multiple occasions that he did not need to knock. He knocked because he wanted to. She had come to understand this. It was his way of saying something he apparently found easier to say with his knuckles on a door. "Come in," she said. He came in, 2 cups of tea in hand. She had already had one, but this had never once stopped him, looking as he always looked in the mornings. Slightly rumpled, not entirely awake, wearing the expression of a man who has emerged from sleep into a life that still, occasionally, surprises him by being what it is. He handed her the cup. She took it. He sat in the other chair, the one that had migrated from across the room over many months until it now sat at a perfectly companionable angle to hers, which had been accomplished by means of such gradual incrementalism that neither of them had ever been required to acknowledge it was happening. Outside, the elm trees moved in the early wind. A pigeon landed on the garden wall, considered the situation, and departed. "Margaret's letter arrived yesterday," Clara said, without looking up from her book. "I know, I saw it on the hall table. She's coming for Christmas. She says she intends to stay through February." A pause. "She said that last year," James said. "She stayed through March." "Yes," another pause. "I'll have the east wing prepared." Clara turned a page. "She'll want the room that looks over the kitchen garden." "She always wants the room that looks over the kitchen garden. She says it's the only room in the house with a sensible view." James said nothing for a moment. Then, with the particular quality he had when he was saying something he meant more than the words directly indicated, "She's not wrong." Clara looked up. He was looking out the window at the kitchen garden with an expression she had come to know well over 2 years. The one that arrived when he thought she wasn't watching, that had nothing performed in it and nothing managed. The one that was simply him, looking at something he valued, without the protective distance he had spent most of his life maintaining. She had fallen in love with him while he was wearing that expression. Not at any single moment, it wasn't that neat, but accumulated over many mornings, many rooms, many quiet instances of watching him choose, again and again, to put the distance down. It had not been simple. She had not allowed it to be simple, and she did not regret that. There were things that needed to be said, and she had said them, clearly and without apology. And there were things that needed to be done, and she had done them. And there were moments in that first year when it had seemed easier to close the door entirely. And she had not closed it, and neither had he. And that mutual not closing of the door had eventually become something that neither of them had a word for yet, but that felt, on mornings like this, like the most substantial thing she had ever built. Better than the kitchen garden, considerably better than the roses. She went back to her book. They sat in the early light without speaking for a while, in the particular silence of 2 people who have run out of the need to fill it. Then James said, "I've been thinking about the Fenwick property. The one adjoining the east field. Old Fenwick's son wants to sell. I thought," he paused, "I thought you might want to look at it. If we expanded the kitchen garden, there'd be room for the cutting garden you mentioned in the spring." Clara lowered her book. She looked at him. He was doing the thing he did when he was slightly uncertain, looking at a point just past her shoulder rather than directly at her, which was the only tell he had left after 2 years of being, on the whole, considerably more honest than he had historically been. "You remembered that," she said. "You mentioned it once in April." "I mentioned it in passing." "You mentioned it," he said simply. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a ballroom, 7 words, her father's laugh, the 3 breaths she had counted to keep herself from showing anything in a room full of people who would have enjoyed seeing her break. She thought about a garden in winter, and a horse in the snow, and an old woman in gray silk who had pressed her hand and said not yet. She thought about a box made of cedar, and her mother's handwriting, and a solicitor's office in April, and a note that said for Clara, when she is old enough to know what to do with it. She looked at James Caldwell, Duke of Ashford, sitting in the other chair in the early morning light with his slightly rumpled coat and his 2nd cup of tea and his careful expression. And she thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, that the distance between who he had been and who he was now was one of the more remarkable things she had witnessed. Not because it had been dramatic, because it hadn't. Because it had been slow and unglamorous and sometimes painful and achieved entirely without audience, which was, she had come to believe, the only way any real change ever happened. "Yes," she said, "I'd like to look at it." Something in his face settled. Outside, the morning light moved across the kitchen garden and the elm trees, and the south-facing wall where the roses were already, 3 years ahead of schedule, beginning to think about climbing. James reached across the small table between their chairs and set his hand next to hers, not on it, just next to it, in the way he had of leaving things adjacent and allowing her to decide. She turned her hand over. He laced his fingers through hers. She went back to her book. He looked out the window. The house was quiet around them, the long quiet of a place that has been many things over many years and has finally, in some rooms at least, become what it was always supposed to be. Not perfect, not without history, but lived in. Genuinely, finally lived in. And as for Clara Vane, the woman who had been called plain in a ballroom, whose father had laughed, who had carried a cedar box across a winter and a year and a city until she understood what she was meant to do with it. She finished her chapter, closed her book, and decided the cutting garden should go in the southwest corner where the light lasted longest. Some decisions are very simple once you know your own mind. She had always known her own mind. It had just taken the world a little time to catch up. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. I'd truly love to know which city you watched from. Reading those comments genuinely makes me very happy. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to leave a like before you go.